Welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma, where we recognize relational recovery as an adventure. I am Amy Gordon, an individual and couple psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you'd like to work with me. This episode is a bit of tough love for anxious attachers. I'm going to start some shit right out the gate and say that anxious attachment is not appropriately named. In fact, it was appropriated. First of all, avoidant attachers have actually been proven to be more anxious, both in general and in relationship, than so-called anxious attachers. Anxious was originally a qualifier for all insecure attachment styles, a prefix. So anxious-avoidant, anxious-ambivalent, anxious preoccupied, for example. And attachment theory's original founders, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, called what we now call anxious attachment ambivalent resistant attachment. Ambivalent meaning feeling two ways at once, and resistant meaning actually rejecting approach by their primary attachment figure. This resistance is also sometimes referred to as protest, opposition, antagonism. There's some different terms that people tend to use, but we know that it's kind of part of the shadow side of so-called anxious attachment. Since the time of Ainsworth and Bowlby, other historical attachment researchers and experts have titled this attachment style anxious preoccupied and angry resistant. If we fast forward to today, anxious attachment has become sort of a shorthand for anxious preoccupied. So that would be the most accurate historical term that applies to kind of the vernacular that we use now. So this kind of collective vernacular has dropped the root word preoccupied and kept only the prefix. But I want to remind you that dismissive avoidant or avoidant attachment was originally termed anxious-avoidant. The prefix was dropped, and it doesn't actually make sense that one attachment style kept the prefix to the exclusion of the root word when it's actually the other attachment style that tends to be more anxious, right? So this would be like dropping aggressive from the term passive aggressive. So instead of saying you're being passive aggressive, you just said you're being passive. It's, accurate, you're passive, but you're also aggressive. And it's important to bring that into the picture sometimes. Neglecting to examine words like preoccupied, ambivalent, or resistant is a huge disservice to anxious attachers and their partners. A reminder that avoidant attachers are more anxious than so-called anxious attachers. And there are a lot of relational psychoeducation materials, content out there, and unfortunately, uninformed couple therapy that, basically perpetuate some severe non-realities in anxious avoidant dynamics. And I'm referring to a partnership between a so-called anxious attacher and a so-called avoidant attacher in that context. Confusing, right? Anxious avoidant is a term more commonly used today to refer to this dynamic versus its original designation as an explicit attachment style. And I'm not by any means like a linguistic elitist and I really abhor pretension. So this is, it's kind of something else. I'm talking about an issue with appropriation and actually denial. I'm all about linguistic evolution, especially as a result of collective creativity and social justice. But I think we've really botched this one up to the detriment of social justice. For most of this episode, I will be using the commonly used terms, but I just had to start out by saying all this. And if you don't believe me, by all means, please fact check. There are a lot of psych pop content creators out there who have perpetuated this coddling of anxious attachers. Let's face it, anxious attachers are sensitive, touchy people, and they want an audience, right? Hell, I was an anxious-leaning, disorganized attacher who has paired historically with mostly avoidant leaning folks. So I really get it. A lot of what I have to say is coming from kind of self-knowledge in addition to, education and training and experience. But what I want to say is these psych pop content creators ignore the aspects of angry resistance and preoccupied antagonism that are just as much of a reality as aggression is in passive aggression. We've adopted this cushier and more innocent sounding anxious attachment because anxious attachers don't really want to hear about the shadow side of their attachment style. But whitewashing the angry, resistant, and preoccupied aspects is a huge disservice because these tendencies do cause harm in relationship. And if you want relational recovery, you're not going to get it through whitewashing reality. I'm a couple therapist. Of course, I've worked with a lot of couples over the years who exemplify the typical anxious avoidant dynamic. And I would say that as a result of the anxious attachment coddling psych pop culture, anxious attachers are showing up more so these days to couple therapy with a severe case of superiority and denial of how they play a role in relational dysfunction. In an earlier episode, I explained how anxious attachment is associated with borderline personality disorder, just as all insecure attachment styles are associated with a personality disorder. The origins of this attachment style are essentially the same, although varying in degree of extremity, as the origins of BPD or borderline personality disorder. The childhoods of both are typified by inconsistent caregiving. So, like with gambling, preoccupation derives from intermittent reinforcement, or obsession derives from that intermittent reinforcement. And in this case, we're not talking about gambling, of course, but it can be a good example of how intermittent reinforcement amplifies attention. But in this case, we're talking about intermittent reinforcement of care and attention. Borderline and anxiously attached individuals had at least one primary caregiver who was sometimes available, sometimes not, sometimes emotionally attuned, and sometimes not. Love was intermittently present, but frustratingly unreliable. In these conditions, a child learns that connection can vanish without warning, that they can just be dropped. So the self organizes around proximity to the other as a result. Anxious attachers become neurologically wired toward preoccupation or obsessive focus upon the object of their attachment. They must be entirely attuned in order to have their emotional needs met. And of course, all of their needs met originally in infancy. Their core fear is that they'll be rejected, disliked, and neglected and or ultimately abandoned. So that core fear is really around being rejected, because rejected kind of equals death for an infant. So all insecure attachment styles lead to some form of codependency, but it's anxious attachers who are entirely programmed for codependency in its truest form, meaning abandonment of self needs and overfocus on the needs of others. So the person's center of gravity revolves around another's psychology and not their own to any sufficient extent. That is to say, the codependent sense of worth is based upon others' affection toward them, and their sense of safety derives from that person's emotional serenity and not their own. For anxious attachers, the withdrawal of affection by their beloved can feel like the end of the world, because it really might have at some point in time. Starting around infancy, the anxious attacher learned that unless the person who is in charge of their welfare is okay, they might not survive. And there's evidence to suggest that anxiously attached babies adapt to their mother's moods and begin suppressing their own emotions in order to influence the mother's mood through smiling and holding back the instinct to wail at times. They do this for the purpose of ensuring the mother is calm enough to attend to their needs. They learned early on that their focus has to be on the other and not themselves. What they want, what they need, and how they feel is secondary to the wants, needs, and feelings of their primary attachment figure. They were never really allowed to express, let alone explore and understand themselves. For this, they eventually become frustrated and resentful. Well, it is a frustrating and infuriating experience all along, but resentment about that experience tends to build. Even starting in infancy, it's subtle, preverbal, implicit, and insidious, but it's there. Babies in the strange situation experiment, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you should look it up. It's not one of the more fucked up psychology studies. I don't think you really need a trigger warning to look into it, but it is really interesting, and it's sort of the roots of attachment theory. But babies in the strange situation experiment were verifiably angry at their mothers upon their return after a short period of absence. And this resentment carries into adult relationships in which the unconscious programming of being hyper focused upon the object of their affection continues because they've adapted to the necessity of orienting their attention toward another. This pattern erodes at their own self development and actualization as life proceeds. They sacrifice, usually without being asked to do so. They effort to please and satisfy their partner, but they rarely experience their partner efforting to please and satisfy them, at least to a comparable extent. So it's obviously a frustrating, or dare I say, angering experience. When they start to become conscious that their excessive generosity has not been fairly reciprocated, they gradually experience increasing resentment. And resentment is experienced as a buildup of anger, grief, and frustration resulting from never having gotten a fair share of the emotional, logistical, and material generosity that they've been required to offer throughout their life. In conjunction with the core fear of being unlovable and ultimately abandoned, this resentment can be paralyzing. This is really where that term ambivalent comes in, anxious ambivalent attachment, meaning feeling two ways at once. They're sort of at this impossible impasse. They're often unaware that they have not simply chosen to be altruistic and find it hard to understand how others could be so seemingly thoughtless in comparison. They feel infuriated in their awareness of others' selfishness, but they also experience an impasse within their own consciousness and struggle to assert their entitlement to mutuality and care because their lived experience has shown them that this is just how relationships are. And on some level, they believe that expressing their desire for a partner to meet their emotional needs would seem too unappealing and demanding. So they hold back out of fear that they would be rejected and abandoned. The term angry resistant comes from this experience of frustration, too. This is ultimately very frustrating. Anxious attachers desire closeness and intimacy, but they also tend to resist approach by their partner because of that underlying frustration or that unresolved anger, that ongoing resentment. And this resistance or guardedness or protest, whatever word you want to use, is a part of their internal operating system that a lot of the more kind of coddling sort of content creators out there never mention. They experience anger regarding their partner's lack of reciprocity compared to their own efforts to please and appease. And because of this, they can be really passive aggressive, punishing, confusing, or perplexing to their partner. Fortunately, anger tends to eventually motivate them to exact change in their relationship. Sometimes it takes years, but eventually, so called anxious attachers begin expressing themselves, albeit not always skillfully at first, just due to lack of experience. But just as disorganized attachers tend to fight and avoidant attachers tend to flee, anxious attachers tend to fawn. But something eventually happens, whether that's having established enough safety and connection in the relationship or a real case of the fuck it's, because they realize there's really no other way to proceed in this relationship. But something prompts them to move beyond their tendency to fawn. Healing requires self-activation, honest communication, and engaging in problem-solving discourse with their partner. It is a frustrating double bind to experience this ambivalence, this both wanting and not wanting intimacy. I've never met an anxious attacher who wouldn't say they want intimacy more than anything, but they also fear being seen that deeply, because to be truly seen means risking rejection. Intimacy requires honesty and vulnerability, but for anxious attachers, these things have historically been a threat to their sense of connection. So remember how babies learned early on to adapt to their mother's moods through suppressing their own emotions? My advice to anxious attachers is to focus on your own sense of safety and trust in yourself and in life. The sooner you feel safe enough to risk a relationship by asking for something you need, the sooner you're likely to see positive change in your relationship. And don't expect your partner to read your mind, because nobody can. Finally, I just want to mention that the overarching tone of resentment toward a more avoidant leaning partner is pressing against their core wound of being flawed and insufficient. And that reinforces their defensive strategies, making things worse. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, that is to say. You're triggering their kind of defensive strategies through your protest and resentment. So just keep that in mind. It's a part of your cycle. The antidote to the shadow side of anxious attachment is honest and vulnerable communication, sharing what you long for, how you really feel, like using I language, not blaming. And with the same approach, also letting your partner know how they affect you. I'll end by saying that might have been tough to hear, but thank you for sticking around. Anxious attachers are really my favorite people to work with. So many gifts and assets come along with your challenges. Just start with believing in yourself, trusting yourself, and knowing that you can trust yourself to lead a great life, even if your needs and vulnerability are incompatible with your partner. Take the risk because you're worth it. And you might be surprised at what happens when you learn to slow down, drop your guard, and speak from your vulnerability instead of protest. As always, I want to encourage folks to get professional help locally or online if you're struggling. I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. I can't ethically make any observation or recommendation without consensually entering a provider relationship with you. If you want to work with me, just reach out through the kind of, all the available means online. I'm Adventures in Relationship on Instagram. And I'll add my usual disclaimer. Don't rely on podcasts or webcasts or AI, for God's sake, as your primary mental health support. Take good care of yourself and your partner if you're committed, because you don't have to abandon yourself to do so. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch or listen. My mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationship. If you can take a moment to follow, rate, review, or share this episode, it's immensely helpful. I put a lot of unpaid time and effort into this offering, so any reciprocation is much appreciated. Thank you so much again for watching or listening. Until next time.